Hello, first of all. Thank you for bearing with us through those brief technical difficulties. But welcome to today's webinar on Research and Evidence 101, an introduction to how audience research can inform more effective ocean communication campaigning. During this webinar, I just want to point out that we have live interpretation available in Spanish and Portuguese. So you should be able to access this by clicking the small globe at the bottom of your screen and selecting the channel for the relevant language. Captions are also enabled for this webinar, and the webinar is being recorded. So this session is part of the Advancing Strategic Ocean Communication project, which is led by a combination of Communications Inc. in partnership with the Calouste Gulbenkian Foundation and the David and Lucile Packard Foundation. For those of you new to this project, it seeks to advance the practice of strategic communications in the ocean sector, to make evidence and tools more accessible to all ocean communicators, and to galvanize greater investment in ocean communications. So you can find out more about the wider project by visiting the Communications Inc. website or signing up to the project mailing list. And my colleague is going to put links for both of those in the chat. Can we go on to the next slide, please? Thank you. So my name is Natalie Hart and I lead on this project, and I'm joined today by my colleagues Natalie Anderson and Elena Sanchez, who both work on the project and are helping me run the webinar. The project as a whole is now a community of practice of just over 500 ocean communicators across the globe. But we were really pleased to see many new names and organisations on the registration to this webinar. Over the course of the webinar, all communication is going to take place over the chat. There will be a few live exercises where we'll encourage you to input your thoughts and reflections. So please do start by introducing yourself in the chat with your names and organisations and where in the world you are joining from today. So over the course of the webinar, we're going to be exploring the question, how can audience research inform more effective ocean communication campaigns? So last year, we had a communication symposium at the UN Ocean Decade Conference in Barcelona. And one of the key findings from the symposium was that communicators wanted more support in how to use research and evidence to make their campaigns more impactful. The content of the webinar today is based on the better practice principles that were developed by our research and evidence chapter group as part of this project, and I will share those with everyone at the end of the webinar. Can we go on to the next slide, please? So what are we going to cover? We're going to be looking at two main questions in the webinar. The first is, what do we mean by audience research and evidence? And secondly, how do we use audience and research to make your campaign more effective? And we know already that in ocean protection work, lots of policies and interventions are often data and research driven. And the kind of argument that we're trying to make here is that communications campaigns should be too. I'm going to give you a really high level overview of some aspects of research communication during this webinar. It's a really big topic, and so please do bear with me that it's going to be a very sort of top level introduction. As you're listening, please do make note of any specific areas you'd be interested in a more in-depth training session on, or if there are specific tools or resources that you would find useful, because this project really seeks to be as responsive as possible to the needs of ocean communicators. After the overview, we're going to look at three areas in a little bit more detail. So those will be audience understanding, content development, and content testing. And for each of those sections, we're going to have a 5-minute exercise for you to start to try out some of the new learnings. One thing before we dive into the content, that I really want to stress is that we at Communications Inc., we work with a lot of NGOs, and we know that communications budgets are really low and research for communication budgets are tiny, if they exist at all. So what we're talking about in the webinar today is not rigorous academic research. It's about doing what we can with the insight that's available to us, gathering more data on a very low budget to try and make our comms more impactful. So on that note, if we could move on to the next slide, please. The first question we want to address is, what do we even mean by audience research or research for communication? We know that this is a really common question that people have. People get confused. Sometimes people think that actually what we're talking about is how to communicate research rather than research to make your communication more impactful. So I actually want to start addressing the question by thinking about what communication itself is. And so communication can be defined as an exchange of information or knowledge or ideas. And usually it's a two-way process. So someone or something transmits information, and then a receiver responds with feedback that can help ascertain whether the message was understood correctly. So on a really kind of simple one-on-one level, you can think of it as a conversation. Someone says something, someone else responds, and then the first person tailors what they say next based on the information they're receiving. So both sides of the conversation are receiving a lot of information. So some of that is verbal, but also you get information based on someone's body language, the way that they're dressed or presenting themselves, or their tone. So if we could go on to the next slide. Let's then consider audience research or understanding as the information that we're getting back in from the audience, the information that we're getting in from the other person. So if we again go to the analogy of a conversation, you approach the conversation differently depending on who you're talking to, whether you know the person or not, whether they're interested to talk to you, and whether this is a formal or relaxed setting. Then as you continue the conversation, you tweak your approach based on the new information that you receive. And so with audience research, this is what we're looking at on a much bigger scale. So we're thinking about what information can we access about our communications audiences that can help us understand how to communicate with them more effectively. And I think if there's one thing that you take from the webinar today, the most important thing is to really pay attention to the audiences that you're communicating with, listen to them, try and figure out what insights you can get from data already available, observe and consider your audience. If you don't do that, as communicators or as campaigners, it's like having a conversation where frankly you're one of those annoying people who just talk and talk and say whatever they want with little concern or awareness as to whether the other person in the conversation is engaged or even wants to be involved. So think of audience research as the other half of the conversation that you're having. If we could move on to the next slide, please. Oh, I think you've skipped one there, Natalie. Have we not got a nice little cycle? Yes. Thank you. So if we think of the communication cycle as a whole, there are multiple stages where information about your audience, research, and insight into the communications challenge can feed into what you're doing. So at the strategy development stage, audience research can help you define your problem or challenge, build a picture of who your audience is, and offer you context about the landscape to define your approach. So your challenge could be anything from influencing consumer behavior in a particular segment of the public to encouraging a particular industry to use less single-use plastic, or maybe you're trying to target policymakers for a specific policy change or better implementation. The next part of the cycle is we have content development, and this is really where you can take all of the information that you've gathered about your audience to really tailor your approach. So you can make decisions on the form, the content, your creative idea, and your dissemination plan based on what you've learned about your audience. And then finally, in campaign dissemination, you can use your research to check whether your campaign is actually working. So is it reaching the audience that you want in the numbers that you require with the effect that you intended? And if that's not happening, how can you use the insight that you're getting back to adapt your approach? Go on to the next slide, please. And so the kind of main question is, why bother doing any of this? And the main reason is really to help ensure that your campaign or your communications effort is doing its job. So you could have a super expensive communications campaign with beautiful visuals, massive engagement numbers, but if your campaign isn't reaching the right people in the right way and having the impact intended, then it could be a wasted effort. So in this sense, research also helps make your communications more cost effective by ensuring that you're spending your campaign money well. And any resources that you are able to put into the research process can help increase your efficiency and return on investment overall. And then the kind of last point that I want to make in there is that it also, doing research helps you to make sure that you're doing no harm. So we know that sometimes communications content is received in an unexpected or unintended way. And we do, as communicators, have an ethical responsibility that even if your campaign isn't making things better, that at the very least it isn't making things worse. And I think this is a consideration that's particularly important in the increasingly polarized communications landscape that we're all a part of. So that's the kind of broad overview done. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go into 3 different areas of research. So how to build your understanding of your audience, how to design your campaign based on that insight, and how you can test understanding. And again, please bear in mind that with all of this, we're thinking about how NGOs can operate on minimal budgets. So first of all, we're going to talk about building a picture of our audience. And so this is really about gathering information, paying attention, really listening and considering who your audience is, and the best way to reach them. So if we go on to the next slide, please. One really key bit of advice at this point is when you're defining your audience, try and be as specific as you can about who you're aiming your communication at. The more specific that you can be, the more this will help you build up an accurate picture of your audience and how to profile them. So really try to avoid developing campaigns where you just target the general public, because that's a very difficult thing to do. And if you do find yourself in a situation where you're working on a campaign that has an audience that broad, one thing that I'd really recommend is you take an audience segmentation approach. An audience segmentation is really just a fancy way of saying, like, break your audience down into smaller groups that have shared characteristics. We could do a whole other webinar on audience segmentation. If anyone is interested in an example, I would say that Climate Outreach in the UK setting did a brilliant bit of research called Britain Talks Climate, where they segmented the broader British public into 7 different segments of shared characteristics. And so that's a really good example if you're looking for a bit more information on that. Could we go to the next slide, please? So imagine that you're trying to build a profile of your target audience. What should you be looking for? What questions should you ask? Um, Here, what I've done is I've put some examples of research, evidence, or information that you might want to find out about your target audience to give you a better understanding. Um, you don't need to gather all of this information on your audience. This is designed as food for thought, so the kind of areas of data that you could look into. I've broken them down into four categories. So you've got demographics, psychographics, media and influences, and behaviors. So demographics will be all of your statistical data related to a population. So things like age, location, socioeconomic status. Then you've got psychographics, and psychographics are more about what your audience thinks, believes, what their values are that you could tap into, attitudes, perceptions, goals. So one way of maybe thinking about it is that the demographics are who your audience is, and the psychographics answer the why question of like what drives them. Um, then media and influences is around where do they go to for their news? Who are their trusted sources of information? And um, that could be media outlets. So that could be things like specific news channels, online newspapers, but it could also be people. So it might be family members, different peer groups, community groups. So there's really quite a broad range from the macro to quite local level on media and influences. And then finally, we've got behaviors. What do your audience do? And this could be general so that you kind of know where to access them, but more likely it's going to be campaign specific. So I'm going to talk through an example in a second that's around the consumption of sustainable fish. And so in this case, behaviors to me would be what do my target audience currently do in terms of where do they buy their fish? What kind of fish do they buy? How do they make their decisions? If we could go on to the next slide, please. Um, so if that's the kind of data and insight you're looking for, where can you get that kind of information? And again, we're aiming for zero cost or budget friendly options here. So I've included in this slide a lot of open data, open access data sources. Um, so one option is surveys and trackers. These can be available on a regional level, on a national level. There are some global trackers that look at public perceptions, attitudes, behaviors that you can then narrow down into your specific region and location. So some that I've got in there, consumer insight databases, um, the Reuters Institute Digital News Report that's good for looking at media consumption trends. There are also some really good regional barometers. So there's the Latino Barometro, which covers the Spanish-speaking world, the Afro Barometer that looks at African nations. There's also a European version of this. And there are also some trackers that are issue specific. So for example, the Ipsos Climate Change Report, which is open access, so members of the public can look at that. That tracks perceptions and attitudes to climate change. I think it's in 35 countries on an annual basis. So that can really kind of help with your landscaping work. You could conduct your own research. And so, in terms of self-run research, there are lots of software for surveys and interviews that you can access free of charge. So, we often use Google Forms or SurveyMonkey. Qualtrics, I think, has a minimal charge, but can be useful for more kind of qualitative research, interviews. You can also run your own focus groups, and we'll talk a little bit about that more in the content testing phase. Academic and think tank studies. So there are probably some people out there who are kind of thinking along the same lines as you in terms of how do we communicate the ocean more effectively. The Frameworks Institute, for example, did a brilliant study on how we can talk about the ocean more effectively that was funded by the Gulbenkian Foundation. We can share these links with you at the end. Yale Climate Communication has a newsletter that kind of puts out regular reports and updates on climate attitudes and perceptions and gives advice on how you can tap into them. And then finally, for those of you lucky enough to have research budgets, there are market research agencies, and this is where you commission an agency to do end-to-end research for you. So you go to them, you give them your communications challenge, you tell them about your audience, and they will conduct either focus group surveys, interviews, and do the analysis for you as well. So that's the end-to-end service. But what we're also seeing more of more recently are self-administered research platforms, which are really interesting for people who don't have massive research budgets but have a bit of money. And what these are software where they're platforms where you design the research yourself. So you design, for example, your questionnaire survey, but these platforms give you access to nationally representative samples globally. So you could upload your survey and then choose oh, we just moved on how to where you want your questions to be asked. If we could go on to the next slide. Thank you. I just wanted to highlight a really specific example of audience data that will be coming soon. So we don't quite have this yet, but it is the Ocean and Society Survey. What this survey is it's a standardized 30-question tool that was developed through international collaboration by members of the ocean literacy research community to better understand the society-ocean or people-ocean connections. The survey focuses on what drives people's attitudes, values, behaviours, communication and trust regarding ocean health. By the UN Ocean Conference in June, this survey will have been administered in around 20 countries globally, with nationally representative sampling. And the data will be made available to everyone in the ocean sector who wants to access it. As I said, it's going to be in 20 countries at the moment, but countries are constantly being added. And so the way it works is it's kind of a collaborative effort and collaborative funding. So if an organization is interested in adding a specific country to the survey, that can be added for around $4,000 per country. If that is something that you're interested in finding more about, please do let us know, because we can put you in touch with the people organising the survey. But we're really excited about what it will mean for communicators. It will certainly be the first time that we've got nationally representative baseline data in countries outside of the UK, Canada, Brazil or US. So that's very exciting for comms research people out there. Could we go on to the next slide, please? Thank you. I'm going to stop talking soon and we'll move into an exercise. What I would like to invite you to do is have a go at filling in an audience profile of your own. So think about a campaign, real or imaginary, and who your target audience would be, and then fill in the information that you already know about your target audience, and also identify where the gaps are and think about where you might find that data. So I recommend, to make this easier for you, to think about or choose an audience that you know a bit about already. the less you know about the audience, the more gaps you'll have. That's okay as well. It might just encourage you to think about different sources. And what I will do for this exercise is I'm going to talk you through an example first, and then I'll give you 5 minutes to go away, fill in a profile of yourself, and then when you come back, I'll ask people to put their reflections in the chat. The purpose of this exercise is really to encourage you to think about different things that you might know about your target audience that you haven't already considered, and to also think about different places that you might be able to find that information. These might be kind of trusted sources of information that you already go to, or you might think about different research methods that you haven't used before. So an example to get you thinking on that. I'm just going to go through an example that I've done to make this a bit easier. Could we go to the next slide, please? So just as an example, I have chosen for my audience profile an imaginary sustainable seafood campaign in the UK, and I've given it a target audience of 25 to 40-year-olds who shop at Waitrose, which is a very high-end supermarket in the UK. I've chosen this as an example. It's a bit cliche, to be honest, but I know it's a place where a lot of sustainable food campaigns are targeted in the UK. So I've filled in my audience profile here. In terms of demographics, what I know about these shoppers is that I know they have a higher than average disposable income. I know that they're often people who are professionals or highly educated. They tend to live in suburban or more affluent areas. And they're often young families, single, or DINK, which is a DEMOG's acronym for double income and no kids. So that's all stuff that I know about them already, but also if I look at for example, consumer indexes online, I can build up more of a demographic picture of that. Psychographics, so values, beliefs, attitudes. I know that these are an audience who are quite concerned about their health and well-being and lifestyle. I know, again, from kind of consumer data that I've looked up online, that they really value quality products. They like things that have an ethical value, and they have quite an aspirational lifestyle approach, and they often make food choices that reflect that. Media consumption influences. I know that these people often read The Guardian or The Times, and they listen to food and well-being podcasts. And then here I came to a bit of information that I was missing. So what I don't know at the moment is what kind of social media this group consume. And so I had to think about where I could go to find out that information. And I thought that maybe I could go to the Pew Research Centre that often has media consumption data, or the Global Web Index to give me a little bit more of an idea of what their social media habits would be. In terms of their behaviours, I know that they're fairly time short people. So we've talked about them being like professionals already. And so I know that they look for well-sourced food, but it needs to have clear labelling. I know that they want high quality food that's quick to prepare. And I know that they're open to new fish species. So I've kind of got a bit of their behaviours in there, but I think there's probably a few more kind of nuggets of insight that I could find. And so I was trying to think here, what else could I learn? And so I did some research into consumer. Again, I keep on using consumer data as an example because that's what this campaign would be. And I know I found out that Waitrose do a food and drink report that talks a lot about its customers and their behaviours. And so I thought that's somewhere that I could go to get a bit more information. So if we could go back up to the previous slide, I am going to give you 5 minutes now to fill out your imaginary audience profile. We'll go off camera, and then after 5 minutes we'll call you back, and then we'll invite you in the chat to tell us how you found that exercise. So what information you think is fairly easy to come across, what was missing, whether anything surprised you or prompted you to think differently. So I'm gonna set the timer for 5 minutes, and we will see you back here very soon. Okay, thanks everyone for doing that. I'm really keen to welcome you to put any reflections in the chat at this point. So how you found the exercise, information that you feel is quite easy to find about your target audiences, any challenges that you had, anything that surprised you. Yeah, Till's made a really interesting point there, that psychographics are tricky, as he lives in a country he wasn't born in. So I fully agree with this. And so I started my life as a researcher predominantly for communications campaigns in the Middle East and North Africa. And it does make it tricky when you're in a population that you're not used to. But I think the flip side of that is, if you're somewhere where you feel a part of the population, you can start to make assumptions about audiences that are wrong. I would really recommend people to look at, there are sort of national perception and attitude trackers, which can be quite good at looking at values and beliefs. Issue salience is one that comes up a lot on national attitude trackers as well. So for example, YouGov does several countries, and it's good to kind of keep on top of the atmospherics of a population and see kind of what's resonating with people, what they're caring about, and then you can maybe think about how to tweak your communications to hook into that. Grace really makes you think about where you're getting your information from, or what your sources are, or what some assumptions you're making. Yeah, totally. And as I said, this is a really we understand that it's difficult, and it's one of those situations where anything is better than nothing, right? Like beginning to ask the questions, beginning to look for data that you can use. It will be imperfect to begin with, and it will be imperfect because we don't have big research budgets. Ali, demographics were all over the place. Yeah. No idea about media influences. That's interesting. I'd be interested to know whether that it was for tourists in a specific location, because then perhaps you could get data about people who visit a particular area that you could use. Right, I'm going to move us on, just because I'm conscious of time. Natalie, could you share the presentation again, please? Thank you to everyone who shared their feedback, by the way, and I hope it was useful to those of you who didn't as well. We're now going to talk about how to use the insights that you have on your audience to develop your content. So if we've gone to the next slide that I can see, we're going to talk about matching your approach to your audience insights. So on this slide, what you'll see is I've identified 4 key areas of campaign development and dissemination that you should be able to fill in, thinking about what you know about your audience. These are content type. So are your audience likely to be attracted to written, visual, video, audio, social media content, or emails, etc.? Channel or platform, so are there specific outlets that they use or follow? Messenger, who is likely to influence them? And message or frame, so what message is likely to encourage a change in attitude or behavior that you want? So you can see a lot of this is data or insight that we've thought about or gathered already, and we're really just now flipping it to move it into campaign development. Um, if we go on, if we can go to task 2, what I'm going to do, because I'm aware of time, is I'm going to talk us through this task, and then you can go back and do it in your own time, just because I want to make sure that we cover all the content today. And so what I was going to ask you to do in task 2, now that you've captured your audience information, is to think about what campaign decisions you're going to make. So take the information that you had about your audience in task 1. Don't worry about the gaps here, just focus on what you do know and try and answer the questions based on your understanding, what type of content you could use, what channel or platform, what messenger, and what message or frame. What I'll do is I'll talk you through my example on this one. And then as I said, this is something that you can go away and do in your own time. So I've gone back to my target audience of 25 to 40-year-old, fairly affluent, high-end supermarket shoppers who we're trying to convince to make more sustainable fish choices. So content type. So what I thought about with this campaign is I know that these are busy people. They want to make good food choices. They kind of like cooking, but maybe don't have much time. So I thought a really interesting content type for this would be actually leading with recipes. So offering them recipes that show quality, sustainable dishes that can feel special, but that are straightforward to make. And then I also know from the kind of media that they consume kind of longer form media and thought pieces. So I thought it could be a recipe-led campaign content-wise with kind of longer thought pieces around that. In terms of channel or platform, so I know behaviorally, I know they go to Waitrose, and I know that Waitrose, from doing some research, has an in-store magazine. So I thought that could be a really kind of quick win in terms of accessing this audience. I knew from the insights that I had on media consumption that this particular demographic, the kind of 25 to 40-year-olds in the UK, are quite high podcast listeners. And so I looked up some podcasts. And so I thought, as an example, maybe having a piece on this podcast called Table Manners. So whether that could be a podcast that's pitched to with the campaign. And then I also know from the additional data that I looked up that Instagram is used a lot. And so I thought if there was an advertising budget, it could be Instagram advertising that's targeted around people on Instagram who are following nutritionists and sort of more well-being influencers. In terms of messengers for the campaign, I know that this is quite high in supermarket, and so I thought about kind of chefs that have some kind of association with that brand already. So food influencers, I kind of thought it would be interesting to have a key messenger. So I put Ottolenghi up there, which would be a bit of a reach, like maybe a bit of a stretch for the campaign, but I think it's good to kind of aim high on it. And then below that, again, sort of nutritionists, well-being influencers who already have a proven following among that demographic. And then for message, I was trying to think what kind of message would appeal to this audience based on what I know about them. And what I can tell from the kind of media that they consume, the behavioral choices that they make, the values that I found through the research, is that these are aspirational people, right? Like they're a little bit bougie, they want to have quite a high-end life. And so the kind of messaging that will appeal to them is equally aspirational. And so the message that I came up with was around making seafood a sustainable luxury. So it's a really positive message framing, and that's something to think about. And so in this case, it's ensuring the message is aspirational and not guilt-ridden. So for this particular audience, I don't think a more negative message framing would be particularly useful. So it's more about the positive impact that making this behavioural choice will have on their life, rather than the negative impact on the ocean were they not to make it. There's nothing that I'm seeing in the insight that would suggest that they would be influenced by that kind of messaging. Okay, thank you. If we then go on to the next slide, Natalie. The kind of final bit. Oh, sorry, I'm just looking at the messages. Jessica, perhaps if you could, I can see your hand is up. If I carry on with the presentation, perhaps you could write your question in the chat and then I'll get to it when I can. Thank you. So is your content doing what you intended? We're going to talk a little bit now about, if we go on to the next slide, please, content testing phase. So testing communications content really means testing how well a piece of content resonates with a target audience. And you can do this by measuring clarity, engagement, and effectiveness. So this process can involve A/B testing, different versions, gathering audience feedback, and analyzing certain metrics like readability, response rates, and social shares. And so the goal of content testing is really to refine your content, tweak it, ensure that it continues to achieve its intended purpose, whether that's informing, persuading, or inspiring action. So what we've actually done through the research exercise that we did to think about the audience profile and then making campaign decisions based on that is we've essentially developed a theory. So we've developed a theory about who our audience is, and based on that, how we think that we can influence them. And that's how we've developed our campaign. What we're doing when we test our content is we're testing our theory. Is it working? Is the content doing what we've planned? If we could go to the next slide, please. So what I'm going to focus on specifically today is thinking about gathering qualitative feedback on your content before it's launched, so before it's out there and you have all of your kind of engagement metrics. To get qualitative feedback on your content, there are kind of 3 key ways that you can do it, kind of essentially going down in budget. So the first one is market research agency delivered focus groups. And what that means is a market research agency will test the content for you. They will take it. They will be responsible for developing a discussion guide for a focus group. They will recruit focus group respondents based on your target audience, and they will take your content and discuss it and then provide you with insights afterwards. For anyone who's not familiar with the term focus group, it's like a guided discussion where you have a moderator and a series of questions that you work through. Then your kind of more mid-range option is to run your own focus groups. So you could do this by moderating the discussion yourself, or you could just hire someone specifically to facilitate the group for you. It's a cheaper option, but it requires a bit of time in terms of setup. So ideally, you'd still find people among your target audience to run the conversation with. And ideally, if you were going to do this, you would ask someone not directly involved in the campaign to run the groups, as they're less likely to be subjective or skew the conversation, or quite frankly, less likely to be kind of protective over their campaign darlings that they want to protect. And then finally, we have anecdotal testing among colleagues, peers, members of the target audience. And what this really means is just showing people and having conversations. This isn't the ideal way of doing it, but I understand that, like, for a lot of organizations who are pushed on time and pushed on resources, this is the way it tends to be done. So what I want to do in the next slide is just, if this is the approach you take, if you just show it to people and ask for their opinion, what questions can you ask that will help this process? Go on to the next slide, please. So when you're gathering feedback on a bit of content, whether it's a logo or a video or social media, the main question that you need to be asking yourself is, to what extent is this product successful in achieving its intended objectives? Like, is it doing what I hoped it was going to do? And so in order to test that, I have 3 recommended key questions. The first is on first impressions. So asking people, what are your first thoughts and feelings on seeing or hearing this? So straight off the gun, if someone looks at something, what are they thinking? The next is asking someone, what does this make you think or feel or want to do? And the third is there anything that you don't think is clear? So again, like, we know the communications environment is really rapid, so you want to understand people's first response. What does it make you think, feel, do? Is it having are people kind of cognitively understanding it in the way that you hoped? Is it eliciting an emotional reaction that's in line with what that you hoped for? And in terms of do, is it triggering any kind of intended behavior change, whether that's like a long-term behavior change or something short, like signing a petition? And is there anything that's unclear for them? Then on the next slide, I have put the question that it is really, really good to avoid. And I know this is a very difficult question to avoid. Natalie, if you go on to the next slide, please. Thank you. Please, please, please try not to just ask people whether they like it, whatever has been created. So why is "do you like it" not a useful question to ask your colleagues or peers if they're looking at a bit of content and helping you out? The first is that it's really subjective. People like and dislike different things, and actually whether they like or dislike it isn't telling you whether it's doing the job that you hope for. The next is it's vague, so people don't really understand what they're evaluating for you, and they can just give superficial yes or no answers. And the third is that it just doesn't answer your question. It really doesn't tell you what impact or what effect the product is having. So really do try to stick to those previous 3 questions. So first impressions, think, feel, do, and is there anything that's unclear? If we go to the next slide. Just to touch on this and save it for another day, content testing can also form an important part of monitoring and evaluation for communications campaigns, in that you can combine qualitative indicators of effect with kind of quantitative measures of reach and engagement and combine those together. That's not something that we'll go into today, but if people are interested in a webinar on comms monitoring and evaluation, let me know, because that's something that we can organise. And then if I see yes, please already. Yeah, I mean, monitoring and evaluation is a tricky one in comms, but we can definitely have a long conversation on this. And so I just wanted to kind of give you a bit of an example of what kind of comms testing can look like. And so to do this, I have taken part of a campaign that we've worked on previously. I say part because I've removed elements of it and taken it out of context for the purposes of using this as an example. And so imagine that you're looking at this in a focus group, and think about what are your first impressions of this Seamounts campaign? What does it make you feel, think, or want to do? Is anything unclear? So I'm going to give you all a minute to look at it, and then what I'm going to show you is an example of a focus group transcript to show you like the kind of examples that you might get if you show someone a bit of content like this, and then what you might be able to learn from that. Okay, so this is the Seamounts Are the Ocean's Lifeline campaign. If we could now, please, Natalie, go on to the next slide. So what I've done here is I've mocked up a focus group conversation, just for those of you who haven't used focus groups for content or campaign testing before, just to kind of give an insight into the kind of things that might come out. So the first thing that you can see is you can see what's worked well in the campaign. So the kind of lifeline metaphor seems to have attracted people's attention. There's a sense of urgency that's been communicated through the image that's really come through. One thing that's been pointed out is that a level of understanding or knowledge about seamounts has been assumed by the piece of content. And so the campaign team might want to think about whether the audience they're directing this at has that level of understanding and awareness already, and if not, how could they build more of a kind of explanation into the campaign. There you can see a bit more about like the visuals are engaging, some kind of suggestion of a simpler tagline, but then for other people it works. And this is the other thing, right, is like people won't always agree on their feedback. And then if we can go on to the next slide, and this is from the question about what, the think, feel, do question. What we can see from this is that the example that I gave you, the main thing that was missing from it was a call to action. And so you can see participant 2 said, it made me care, but I didn't know what the next step was. And then the participant 1 has said, yeah, something like tell policymakers to protect seamounts or support a ban on destructive practices would be clearer. So there you've got from your focus group respondents that that the content was doing the job in grabbing their attention, but it wasn't then helping them make that next step into action. I guess the other point just to make here is in focus groups, you're looking at trends in responses to feedback. You definitely do not have to change your campaign based on every single bit of feedback that you get. And I just wanted to include the last example in there. So participant 3, make the key message even simpler, maybe use a question. When you do focus groups and content testing, people love to be put in the creative seat, and people will come up with all kinds of ideas, and you really don't have to take them. And I think most people do know this already, but I do sometimes feel like if you're doing comms in quite a small organization, there's maybe a sense of pressure that you have to respond to all feedback. And what I'm saying to you is look for themes of what's coming through, but don't feel like you have to respond to every little thing. Next slide, please. So I'm aware, I was going to say we're coming up to the end of our time, but we're 2 minutes past it. Thank you to everyone who's able to stick on. We are wrapping up now. I just wanted to share some final key messages or takeaways that I hope you'll take from this whistle-stop tour of research communication. The first is, please, please, please put your audience at the heart of the campaign design. The more that you know about them, the better. The next is something is better than nothing. So whatever research and insight you can bring to the campaign will help. Even if it's only a tiny bit of research, it's probably a lot more than what a lot of other people are doing at the moment. And the final point is, if you work for an organization that does have a little bit more of a bigger budget, if you invest in research, it makes the money that you put into communications more effective. But there are options for smaller budgets and no budgets at all. If we go on to the next slide, please. So I'm going to wrap up now. We are going to be releasing on the Comms Inc. website next week a document called Research 101. That's a document that's just a broad overview of using research for your communications. That will be available in English, Spanish, and Portuguese. In that document, there will also be a link to a folder on Google Drive that has a lot of really brilliant studies that we found and that we use in our campaign development that are open access. So if you click on that, you should have access to all of those. I also mentioned at the beginning of the call that our research and evidence chapter group developed some best practice principles for using research and evidence. Those are available on the Ocean ISU Comms Inc. website via the link in the chat. So you can see those, and we also have better practice principles that were developed under other themes such as messages and messengers and training and evidence. As I said, we're going to be running more of these expertise sharing sessions between now and the UN Ocean Conference. You can sign up to our newsletter for updates on those if you don't get them already. We're planning on soon sharing updates for our April and May sessions in the newsletter. Thank you so much to everyone who has joined us. If you do have, as I said at the beginning, any thoughts on like specific training that you think would be useful, or any specific resources or tools that you think would make the lives of ocean communicators a little bit easier, make our work a little bit more effective, then please do let us know. You can either write that in the chat now, or if you need to hop off, please do email us with suggestions. I think, impact evaluation noted till it was definitely on our list already. But thank you so much to everyone who joined. I'm sorry we didn't get through all of the exercises, but as Natalie said, we'll be putting the recording of the webinar on our website next week. Natalie's put the email address in the chat. Any feedback that you have on this session would be very much welcomed. And I hope that there has been a couple of nuggets that will be useful to all of you. Thanks.